Alright, so the idea is this. You have a personal and you have a historical. Histori. You have a personal and a historical sort of quest for perfection, as represented by immortality. But technically perfection. I just don't feel like writing the word perfection. The individual history is going to be directed by, it's going to have the desire for personal immortality. The historical process is going to unfold via toward a state of perfection. And technically it's historical. Historical perfection. Historical perfection could only exist, where both of these narratives sort of fuse then, is that both of these could only exist in an absolute state of sort of peace. Nietzsche says in a previous section, there wouldn't be, the quest, I want to find it directly. He says on previous section, page 59, number 2, bullet point number 2, bullet point number 2, the ideal is simply a form of dream, weariness, weakness, the ideal state of the herd animal that no longer wants to have enemies, right? There's no conflict. Everything is subsided. All tensions have subsided. Both of these end in sort of universal peace, right? It's either going to be my own personal peace, or it's going to be historical perfection. History has reached its phase where we recognize what? Where we recognize what has always been. This is not true, according to Nietzsche. This is the misconception, according to Nietzsche. Where we recognize what? We recognize that it really was a battle between good as such and bad and evil as such. And in the end, the good will win. And in the end, the good will win. And once the good win, and once justice and good and what have you prevail over evil and bad, then, and only then, will we have this universal peace. Right? But the idea is, according to Nietzsche, is the very attempt to, I mean, it's way before we even get to this point. The problem is right here, for Nietzsche, right? It's right here. It's the quest itself, right? It's the desire itself. It's the desire. The root of the problem for Nietzsche is the desire, right? This is the problem. The problem is the desire, right? This is what I think a lot of people miss in the nuances of Nietzsche, because either they go through it, it's not that people aren't reading Nietzsche, but I think a lot of people just pick up the book and breeze through it really quick and say, oh yeah, I've read it. Sure, you've read the words, but do you really understand what he's saying, right? You can't just breeze through this, right? The root of the problem is the desire. As an individual, your desire is improperly located in personal immortality. And insofar as you have that desire, you leave yourself open to manipulation by institutions. Nietzsche would say, probably say, manipulations by institutions that, quote-unquote, prey on the desire of individuals that have that desire, right? Those individuals that have the desire for personal immortality, right? And there are various religious institutions and disciplines and belief systems that play into that desire, right? Similarly, I think Nietzsche would say, and I think this is a fair account. Now, you know, I'm open for discussion on this, but similarly, I think Nietzsche would say that with respect to, now granted, social construction comes much later, but the fact that it exists is something that's been a fact of human existence since the beginning of humans. Humans construct their societies. So it might be, granted, a bit anachronistic to use the term social construction for Nietzsche, but the fact that social construction existed, it existed. It wasn't created, it was discovered. It had always been there. On that account, the problem is the historical, right? And the question becomes, what is the historical sort of correlation to, this is a problem, what is the historical correlation, right? The historical correlation is the assumption that the progression of society is one that is related to a progression towards perfection, right? History isn't a desiring thing, right? That would be to anthropomorphize history. The idea is that history is itself unfolding in a process toward something. Nietzsche would say, I think, and I would definitely say that history is unfolding towards a process of increasing, hopefully, efficiency, increasing complexity, increasing accessibility. Sure, we can argue that, sure. To say that society is unfolding, is becoming, right? And I don't want to get platonic between being and becoming, but to say that historically speaking, global history, our history as human beings, is unfolding to a state of perfection, it's a quick slippery slope before you go Nazi on that, right? The perfect human being. It's a quick slippery slope before you start talking about the perfect society, right? And I'm not knocking communists, right? I'm not knocking, hardcore. I don't want to get into the variations of communism and stuff, but, you know, communists who say that a true communist society is the perfect society, the argument is, well, what happened when that was attempted? It seemed to fail. I think almost all scholars of any note would agree to some extent that communism was a fail. Aha! So it is democracy then. Democracy is the real perfect institution, political institution. Well, you know, you have people that disagree with that. You have people that say, no, what ends up happening with democracy is that the deaths aren't as directly observable as is the case with communism, that it's, as Galtung would say, the deaths in democracy are a result of structural violence. That the deaths are there, but they come as a consequence of the institution itself, not the soldier. So, in communism, maybe you can say it's a failed system because the soldiers are doing the killing. In democracy, it's not the soldiers that's doing the killing, it's the system itself that's doing the killing. But in the end, how can you say we're going to a more perfect system? And that's the argument, right? The idea is that there is no perfection, right? This is not directed towards any state of kumbaya, any state where everyone is going to live happily and, you know, roast marshmallows. No, the best possible world, as Leibniz would say, is this world. This is the best of all possible worlds, right? You want to get into possible world semantics, we can have that discussion and blah, 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 right? You want to get mathematical on it, we can have the discussion, that's fine too. The idea in an embodied realization of my personal existence in this world, the only epistemic knowledge that I have is of this one world. I can conceptualize possible worlds, I can theoretically discuss it. The only thing I know, and I know for certain, is this. And according to Nietzsche, this has an end. Similarly, the historical progression, the historical narrative, is not moving towards perfection. We don't even get to this point, right? The problem is really with the way in which we, as social constructionists, tell the narrative that moves us into the future. Who's telling those narratives? How are they telling those narratives? How is it that hegemony is using us to tell that narrative? You know, it's far too complicated for this this lecture series, but that's the idea. Okay, so the next bit is, this is middle of page 60, quote, the projection of the ideal into the anti-natural, and we know why it's anti-natural. It's a rejection of, in a sort of cliche sense, it's a rejection of the natural, a rejection of existence. Anti-actual, right? It's not only just anti-natural, it's a denial of what actually is. Illogical, the state of him who thus judges, and this is important, judges the impoverishment of the world, right? This goes back to sort of 12b, the rejection of the world, the ability to disassociate oneself from the world because the world is so impoverished a state. As consequence of suffering, one takes, one no longer gives. The anti-natural ideal.